Hi all, and welcome to the Truth, Honour and Integrity Show. My name's Thomas Williams, and this is a special show, and that particular song is the title of this show, From Russia with Love. Now, there's been a lot written about history. Hasn't really made sense about Russia, and I thought I would do a show, and it involves a lot more than Russia, and it may not be completed in one show. There's a lot of material to get through, and we'll see how we go with it. We may do a part 2 tomorrow evening, or maybe next Sunday if we don't get through it. But on our paths of discovery, many aspects of the truth and revelations have shocked us to the core. That this was a lie, no, this and that was a lie as well. And you read the next chapter of discovery, and it therein contains a whole heap of more lies. One giant tapestry of deception on so many levels that permeates throughout all levels of society and its operations. Now, the truths in history, as in his story, it was always written by the victors of the spoils, they say. And another line is, make a lie big enough and repeat it often enough, and then it stalls itself as the new truth. Now, truth is a funny thing, as it is subjective to the individual at the time, but not always fixed at that time. Providing the individual remains open to all possibilities, that truth can sometimes change, as new revelations present themselves in a way that triggers the individuals to take notice of it and possibly realign with it. Truth has been distorted due to a lack of knowledge, criminally denied to us as a species, and has subsequently severely hampered our development as a species also. Like the education system tells you, repeat after me. But is it not the case you are blindly repeating something you have no idea of whether it's correct or not? The teacher tells you it is, and many just accept it. But who said the teacher is knowledgeable? No one. You just assumed they were. Same applies to the government. And this is what has led us to being where we are today, searching for answers. Gandhi said the truth is the truth, even if it's in a minority of one. Society tells you, teachers, doctors and mainstream media, that they provide the truth. So that one person can't possibly be right or true. That is what is known as programmed thinking. And the only way to avoid that is to be a critical thinker. Add in some long-term memory and an ability to overview things, and you get yourself one badass for the programmed society. And in general, you become a target for attacks from the system. They don't want people waking up. And frankly, stupid people who propagate the whole system of control up. Any true observer will see this madness for what it is. Total insanity. This show will peel back the layers and the players of the lies that delves into one particular region of the planet of which we know so little about, and what we do know is distorted beyond all reality. That country is now known as Russia. We will be delving into the missing names and the peoples during the show. Now, if I ask you to name 3 things to describe Russia, most people will say commies or communists, Putin and vodka. That's their story, not her story. And it has been brutally destroyed and hijacked perhaps more than anywhere else across the world. Well, tonight we are going to redress the balance in this show in some way, where you will learn who are the Rus, Lemuria, lost continents, wizards, how it was taken over, and the current version of communism implemented, and by whom, evolutionary advanced human beings, E.T. help and the teachers, E.T. destruction, and how modern civilization span not out of Africa, but out of the Slavic, Aryan, Rus regions. How religions have distorted the original teachings. Where did those teachings come from? Ancient wars, ancient peoples, death, destruction, and the receding of life, and the ongoing battle to restore humanity back to the levels of spiritual evolution the people of the Rus, Slavonic, Aryan were at back in those times. And ultimately a triumph of light over dark, done in a way that doesn't wipe out the dark, but gives them a chance to redeem and come back into balance. But before we get into the deeper layers of the ancient past, I would like to cover the modern version of the destruction of what was then known as the USSR, and by whom. I know, and I have relayed in other shows, that World War I was all about stealing the wealth and destroying Russia. At the same time, certain peoples who were instrumental in that catastrophic collapse of a country and its peoples were busy in another country setting the stage for future battles of control via the Balfour Declaration. This was readying the stage for creating a new country to stage their version of death and destruction, control and resource stealing, whilst feeding the lower astral with a plethora of deaths and karmic energy. That was all done in England, meanwhile the stage being prepared in Germany for another theatre of operations, and all this took place around 1919. Not long after, the same group of people took over the world financial centre known as the Federal Reserve. A systematic global takeover by one particular group doing the dirty work of a hidden element many people deny exists, but it also must be remembered that we must not tarnish all the peoples connected to the group as all being the same. They are not, and have been damaged in more cleverer ways using psychology than their political agenda peoples have done to Russia and many other countries. The beginning of this show is about the Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1919, and I hope you enjoy this show, and here is a piece of music to get us started. Right, let's get into the meat of the show. A lot of this material, for those who like to know where the background came from, is predominantly by a guy called Nikolai Levashov. There has been numerous other sources, both in Russia and America, plus my own knowledge and opinion has been interspersed into this piece, and I hope you enjoy it. Right, among the many great empires of the world, there has been much history revealed, whether it was the Roman, the British, the Ottoman, Genghis Khan, the Greek, and the current American empire, as it's called, and all of it lavished with narratives of great achievements in battles and conquests, and yet curiously hardly any of the rest of the world know of the Rus Empire, or the region of Tartaria, or even less about the whole continent that went missing north of Siberia. History's teachers never told us any of that knowledge, and tonight we'll find out why. Now, back in 1919, when the USSR was being looted, having lost the war, a revolution, as it was called, took place, not by the Russian people, but by outsiders claiming all the spoils of a deliberately engineered war. Why did I say it was deliberate? Well, the plans of which were laid out in 1888 by Albert Pike, who was a 33-degree Mason, where it stated that this was to be the first of 3 world wars the clowns in power wished to unfold on the people of Midgard. That is the real name of Earth. Earth means inhabited planet. this will become clear later in the document. Now, these were all laid out as some sort of mystical prophecies by Albert Pike, but delve deep enough into all the so-called prophets and prophecies, and a hidden dark agenda appears when you scratch the prophet's surface. Prophecies are not possible, are possible future events. Far from it. They are prophecies, and there are and were plans the clans in power wanted unveiled. You see, to them, all the world is, or soon to be was, a stage. They played the lead roles, and we were the extras in the scene, expendable ones at that. So having played out Act 1 with World War I, they now went about creating the next stage in the theatre of operations. All people or nations of the earth, independent of their real role in the world's fate, wrote their great history. There would be nothing wrong with this, except it appears that everything that concerns Russia is filled with obvious hatred on the part of those who wrote the history of the Russian people. In their opinions, the Slavs lived in earth pits until the 9th century and were so primitive that they did not even have their own state system and had to invite the Varangians, which is Swedish, to govern them. But what historians neglected to mention is the Swedes had no organised state then either, and were essentially ran by criminal gangs who looted their neighbours. Now, the Varangians were the Vikings, or the real meaning of Vikings, VI, which is 6 kings. They operated under the 6 kings flag. Now, the historians were also terribly ignorant until the 9th century, stating that 2 saints, Cyril and Methody, created the Slavonic written language on the basis of the Greek one, and thus gave the light of knowledge to the dull Slavs. Not really. Moreover, history also states that the Mongol Tartars had kept the Russian people in slavery for 300 years, and only when Peter the Great cut through a window through Europe and transformed Russia according to the European image and likeness did Russia become the great empire. So that is the kind of history of Russia as they have portrayed it. It appears that the modern history of the Russian people was actively created at the time of the Romanovs dynasty, which came to power in 1613, and the Bolsheviks took the baton from them after the revolution of 1917, or so we're told. The Romanovs' history of Russia was created in the 18th century by the great Russian historiographers, people who were not from Russia, didn't even speak Russian, and yet they wrote Russian history. And some of these people were Siegfried Beyer, aka Mayer, aka Rothschild, Gerhard Friedrich Müller, August Ludwig von Schlosser, all of whom were German. Not, like I said, none of them had learnt Russian, but nevertheless they wrote the whole history of the Russian state. A pretty interesting picture is observed by anyone who feels like it, be they German or Jewish, can write the history of the Russian people, but it appears that the Russians, who were made out to be so primitive that they were unable to write their own history. Now, there was many of the Russian historians were dismissed completely, and a couple in particular, Gumilev, spent his best years in a concentration camp, and Fomenko and other historians were disregarded because they were declared not certified specialists. So these Germans and later the Jewish peoples essentially did an overwrite of Russian history and completely neglected the Vedics of the motherland. Their knowledge and light mastery all conveniently reconstructed in their image and continued what started over 1,000 years ago, known as the Night of Svarog. Now, according to the Vedic texts, the Nights of Svarog are areas of space in which our planet periodically enters with the rotation of our galaxy, and which creates a negative evolutional warp. This launched 1,000 years of dark, which ended in 1996. Now, if the term Vedic text seems familiar to you, and you are thinking it's all to do with India, this show will show exactly where those texts originated from, and it was not from India. Now, Rurik the Varangian, the Viking, was invited to reign according to the then existing Slavonic tradition, which was to choose a ruler, the most deserving Slavonic prince at the Vesh, which means a popular assembly. This kind of invitation usually was temporary and only in the matter of special services for the good of the people. A leader for the people, oh my. The rule of a prince could be lifelong, but it was never inherited. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that in Rus there were two branches of power, a civil authority, people, and a military one, which was initially were equivalent to each other. That is, one authority did not submit to the other. These branches of power served as a counterbalance to each other, preventing one from dominating over the other. And oh, how America and other countries require that balance of governance now. But Rurik created the Russian state with Russian laws from the Vikings' law system, which in principle can be reduced to one law, the law of the sword, or simply the law of force. So according to history rewritten, the Slavs were a backward race that needed ruling, and yet they had a whole empire known as the Slavonic Aryan Empire, with a sophisticated state system, long and deep books of knowledge, operating in a higher frequency and evolutionary spiritual development, way beyond any other species before or since, for thousands and perhaps millennia, whose whole empire encompassed most of Europe as its provinces. So let's shed light on the real history of the great Russian people. It is often stated that chauvinism is alien to the Russian people, and not a single minority resident on the territory of the Russian state was destroyed, even when they came as enemies. They all kept their language, culture and traditions. In addition, many minorities were kept safe only because Russian blood was shed. The Georgians, Armenians, Tajiks, Kyrgyz, Kazakhstans and Kalmucks, and many others were saved from being wiped out by their enemies, something the Chechens have forgotten the most. They appealed for help against Russian chauvinism, as they called it, to the world community and primarily to the United States of America, for some reason forgetting or simply not knowing that in this very country, Russia, which defends human rights all over the world, but human rights for some reason were repeatedly violated. Now, when the migrants of Western Europe arrived in North America, there were about 20 million American Indians, almost the same number of people that lived in the whole of Western Europe, who formed more than 2,200 tribes and nations of the pre-Columbus America. Today, only 500 tribes with a population totaling about 800,000 people that live on reservations in which are the worst and least productive parts of their motherland. So 1,700 tribes of Native Americans disappeared from the face of their own land but their number could now have been equal to the European population. The same happened as a reference to the Japanese people. People of Japanese origin were thrown into concentration camps in 1941 just because they had Japanese roots. And the Americans never shed a drop of their blood rescuing others. It is true that they politely offered the Kingdom of Hawaiian Islands their protection from the Japanese, which was provoked by Roosevelt, but for some reason their defending and care went so far that since Hawaii has become the 50th state, perhaps persons interested could ask the native Hawaiians what they think about this kind of defence and care. But for some reason no one sees all this, while Russia is blamed for all deadly sins. And this was done instead of gratitude that Russia saved dozens of small and not so small from total extermination, both physical and spiritual. Certainly, as in the history of any other country, Russia has had its black days. There were enough degenerates and dregs amongst the Russian people who held nothing sacred. They became social outcasts at their own wish and treated their motherland like the enemy. Luckily, there were not so many of them. But the most powerful blow to the Russian people, who were formerly the Hyperboreans, Aryans' direct descendants, was inflicted at the dawn of the day of Svarog, when in 1917 black Freemasons, as in dark Freemasons, not necessarily black the colour, who for the sake of public opinion called themselves Bolsheviks, took power in the Russian Empire. There were almost no ethnic Russians in this black power, which pounced upon the people of Russia, on their culture, history, with all its force. In the concentration camps created by Lenin's lifetime, millions of Russians were housed the cream of the nation, the Russian nobility, the Russian intellectuals, the whole of the corps of Russian officers, all Russian industrialists, all Russian merchants were all killed. All of them. All these classes were destroyed, sparing no one. Not only men, but women and children and old were mercilessly killed outside of any court and trial, because no court would be able to bring any legal foundation to justify the destruction of entire classes of society according to the principle of belonging to a class. And yes, all this took place with the implicit agreement of the rest of the world, often with its active assistance, and no one yelled about the genocide of the Russians, about the destruction of the flower of the Russian nation. Most people bred into the Soviet Union education system can object, but these were the representatives of exploited classes. The great Karl Marx and his no less great, in inverted commas, or quote unquote, followers like Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Ulyanov, which is Lenin, Leo Trotsky, whose real name was Bronstein, and many, many others wrote and said so. All people mentioned above, as well as most other theorists and practical workers of the revolution, were ethnic Jews. So why is the revolution in Russia called the Great Russian Revolution, if Jews theoretically laid the foundation and put it into practice using the money from the American Jewish people? Now, the last part they mentioned about the money, $20 million was delivered to Russia in August 1917 by Leo Trotsky, who was an ethnic Jew born in the Russian Empire, but also was an American citizen. It was this money in gold which was an unbelievably enormous sum for those times, from the Russian ally known as America, which allowed the black Freemasons of Judaic nationality to hire Latvian hitmen, Chinese criminals who, together with Judaic fighting squads, perpetrated the Great Russian Revolution. Now, after the overthrow of the Russian government and the death of all the officials, the demographics of the important positions in Russia changed drastically. Now, according to the data that was furnished, out of 556 important functionaries of the Bolshevik state in 1918-1919, there were 2 Ukrainians, 11 Armenians, 35 Lets, known as Latvians now, 15 Germans, 1 Hungarian, 10 Georgians, 3 Polish people, 3 people from Finland, 1 Czechoslovakian, and 1 Karen. And the 2 key figures that are left, just 17 people were Russian. By far the largest number of peoples, at 82% of the overall numbers, was 557 Jewish people. And that was the Great Russian Revolution. So after the Great Russian Revolution had won and the flower of the Russian nation had been destroyed, new black rulers organised an artificial famine. So they went one step further, which ultimately starved to death 20 million peasants. This was after destroying the higher classes. The vast majority of those people were killed were the Rus people, Ukrainians, and the Belarusians. Then they set about trying to make people voluntarily enter what is known as kibbutzim, which is collective farms, an idea that came from Lazar Kaganovich, who presented the idea to Joseph Stalin. Both of them were Zionists. A Zionist education was implemented that was stated that the peasants must operate in the light, and in order to do so, that to the Russian Muzhik, the Israelites in power decided to organize what they called the Enlightenment of Souls, and created an artificial famine, taking away from the peasants all their grain and all their seeds. On collecting an enormous amount of first-class grain, communists sold it for nothing on the American exchange through the Soviets' best friend Armand Hammer, who was another Zionist, thus causing a crisis at the exchange, as a result of which the American farmers were forced to either throw away their own grain they had produced or sell it for peanuts to Hammer. He then sent barges filled with this grain for the starving in the USSR in exchange for priceless religious artifacts. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had accumulated these knickknacks for well over 1,000 years, had all their artifacts looted in exchange. Those artifacts tell a lot of our history. This is possibly why it may have been a more historic importance than people realized when the Russian Orthodox Church visited Israel for the first time, possibly ever, recently. Perhaps they were getting some of the artifacts back. So how did the new rulers' lives go? Well, they lived a lot better than the Russian people did. In essence, these were migrants, not natives. But they, as a member of the kibbutz on the territory of Eretz Yisrael, they received from the state a cottage for the time he lives in a kibbutz, and also received a salary. In return, he had to work off that salary only a few hours a day, and the rest of the time he could spend learning Hebrew free of charge or study. A migrant was free to do all this only if he wishes to do so, but never under compulsion. So while the Israelite Bolsheviks drove the Russian peasants into collective farms by force, taking away everything they had gained by their labour, but the forcing of the Russian peasants into collective farms ultimately failed. So the Zionists came up with a new plan. A wealthy peasant was known as a kulak, the Russian term for wealthy farmers, and 5 million persons immediately were stripped of all their possessions and sent to Siberia, with only the clothes they wore when being thrown out of their homes. Now, history will tell you their history, not the real one. These were voluntary migrants, but they weren't sent to places with cottages, ready-made cottages in well-equipped settlements, but they were told to live al fresco in the open country, more precisely in the Virgin Taiga, which is essentially unincorporated land, no buildings, no agriculture, nothing. The people, 5 million of them, were dropped off in the middle of nowhere and given one axe, one saw and one shovel for the whole group. And basically they were back to hunter-gatherers and rebuilding. But sadly few could survive the harsh winter conditions. After all, this was Siberia. Now, history told us that the party of the Bolsheviks served the proletariat, aka the revolutionary class, but neglected to specify that the party of Social Democrats, hello, Hillary, the Bolsheviks faction came from the Bund, B-U-N-D, which was a Judaic nationalistic party, in other words, a Zionist party. There are almost no workers or peasants amongst the Israelites. It's hardly revolutionary when it only appears to serve one class of people that were not native to that region. That means the so-called revolution was really an invasion of Russia. The fact that all highly qualified workers were the first people the Bolsheviks destroyed, this class whose interest the Bolshevik Leninists defended so zealously by the means of the dictatorship of the proletariat, was simply wiped out by them. But the fact of the matter is that before the revolution, the skilled workers did not need anyone defending their interests. They got a good salary, which was at times greater than their colleagues in the so-called more developed Western countries. There were kindergartens and day nurseries in their enterprises. They could afford to spend their holidays in Italy and Greece, which obviously did not coincide with the image of the oppressed class, which had nothing to lose except for its own chains. In order that there would be no one who could appeal against this kind of defence, they were simply destroyed out of sight, and then it's much easier to defend the interests of an already non-existent class. This can be confirmed by the fact that at the moment of the revolution, there were 25,000 members of the Bolshevik Party, almost all of whom were professional revolutionaries. and the majority of them lived in immigration, being in need of nothing, which required in those times considerable sums of money to keep them going. Now, a professional revolutionary is only engaged in the revolutionary activity and nothing else. So in other words, and to bring it up to modern day terms, these revolutionaries were mercenaries, like the Blackwater Group. So if there had been workers in this party, there would have only been former ones. All party members were professional revolutionaries whose work consisted in the undermining of the existent political system and required enormous financial means to do so. Therefore, bank robberies and other similar methods used by the criminal soldiers of the party, and by the way, Joseph Stalin was one of them, could only introduce a tiny share. The main means for the Russian Revolution came far away from America, and oddly enough, the American multimillionaires who played the role of Santa Claus for the Bolsheviks again, these American multimillionaires, for some reason, were all Jewish. It turned out to be quite strange, the Great Russian Revolution, didn't it? Prepared by Jews, performed by Jews, financed by Jews, and the country was headed by Jews after it. But nevertheless, in all the history books, it's still called the Great Russian Revolution. A revolution that destroyed mainly only Russians and the Slavs. Stalin subject to repression dozens of millions of persons, the majority of whom again were Russians, Ukraine and Belarusians. Certainly all other people who lived in Russia also suffered from all of this, but the overwhelming majority of the victims of the regime were the Slavs, Russian people, as well as most of the victims of the Second World War. Now, we've already spoken about 30 million being destroyed in the First World War and the aftermath. In fact, it's near 40 million. But during the Second World War, out of the 50 million people who died, 30 million of them, 60%, were people of the Soviet Union. In comparison, the Germans lost around 9 million people. Doesn't make much sense, that, does it? However, even when the war was finished, the process of the destruction of the Slavs did not stop. It only took other forms. In fact, the whole 20th century, the last century of the 1,000-year night of the Svarog, and the night of the Svarog began in 6496 according to the Slavonic Aryan chronology, which is roughly 988 AD, and finished in 7504 of their chronology, which is 1996 in our calendars. Was essentially the century of the genocide of the Russian people, which lost, according to different calculations, from between 70 to 90 million people of its sons and daughters, and this was only the direct loss. So when the world accuses Russians of the distribution of the communist pest, I sense there must be a great bitterness in Russia because of this kind of injustice. They weren't communist to begin with. Now, for me personally, if I was asked the essence of why I do what I do, the answer will always be injustice and the wrongness of this world. Now, the final portion of this section of the show is from Nikolai, when it asks, who yells about it most of all? And it's exactly those who are the real culprits in all these crimes, the people known as the Israelites, not all of them, I'm going to make that quite clear throughout this show, who hypocritically making themselves out to be the victims of this system. In essence, they are. History yet again rewritten by the hands of the victors, and it's way past time humanity received the real truth and make up their own minds as what is real and what is not. I want to make it clear again, this is in no way disparaging to all Jewish people, no more than American people can all be blamed for the total genocide of the USA Inc. military has perpetrated globally since World War II. This is a select group within their community, being led by insidious psychopaths that care not for humanity in the slightest, and least of all the Jewish people themselves. To them, it's all about a political ideology and an agenda, with an end goal of them controlling the whole world, its people, the knowledge and our resources, and then holding us to ransom. I think it's high time the treasonous act against humanity is shut down once and for all, and the people see Russia and its people in a new light, and I mean light and not the total darkness that has been portrayed to the rest of the world. We're going to have a music. Hi all and welcome back. A fairly sobering story, that, and sad one. But it won't all be sad, this show. We will get into various topics. And the next one kind of sets the stage for what the people known as the Rus and another people known as the Urs. Now, man as a living organism occupies a certain niche in the ecological system of Earth. In fact, this niche is not arbitrary, but one which corresponds to the abilities and properties of a human organism and is in his way of life as a gregarious living creature. Therefore, the appearance of man as a species becomes possible only when an Earth's ecological system becomes complex and multi-level enough in the process of its own evolution development for free ecological niches to then appear. Now, the latter impose on the species which try to master them certain requirements. The adaptation to these niches result in the appearance in these species of the properties and qualities necessary for the origin and development of the mind. So everything must be in place before man or other living being has or can develop and thrive. So, in other words, the evolutional development of the vegetative world as the foundation of the pyramid of all living matter on any planet results in the appearance of mind at a certain stage of its development. Every ecological niche imposes certain conditions and limitations on the species which occupy it, such as the size and forms of living organisms, qualitative and quantitative composition of food, a certain periodicity of vital processes. Only these organisms which manage to adapt themselves to these requirements and conditions were able to survive during evolution. So let us see what happened to the ecological compartment occupied by modern man before his appearance on Midgard Earth, who dwelt in our ecological compartment. Well, before Homo sapiens, modern man appeared on the evolutional arena. His ecological niche had been occupied by a humanoid species which the anthropologists called Neanderthal man, who had thoroughly mastered his ecological compartment for several 100,000 years. Now, besides Neanderthal man, forced all other humanoid species out and reigned on Earth alone. Thus they populated the whole Earth and all its climatic zones, but nevertheless different races of the Neanderthal men failed to appear during all these millennia. Only one Neanderthal race reigned over the whole world, and each considerably excelled Cro-Magnon man physically, and was also covered by thick hair which they could never get rid of. A saber-toothed tiger was the only serious enemy which could cause them some trouble, and also Neanderthal men devoured individuals of their own species at the time. Everyone who was not a member of their clan, herd or tribe could be considered as food. Now, certainly it's difficult to judge Neanderthal men's intellect, but there is no proof that they were more stupid than Cro-Magnon men also. So they had reigned calmly for essentially hundreds of thousands of years until about 40,000 years ago. No one knows where modern man suddenly appeared. 3 races, black, red and yellow, appeared on Midgard Earth then, while the white race had appeared about 600,000 to 800,000 years before. The fossil remains of modern man, which have been found on different continents of Midgard, have exactly this age. For subjective and objective reasons, there is no information about the fossil remains of modern man on the territory of Siberia or about the sunken northern continent. Homo sapiens appeared everywhere at once on all continents. He was naked, without hair all over his body, and was weak in comparison to Neanderthal man. Several quite different races which had considerable differences in both the colour of the skin and the structure of the skull, skeleton and type of exchange processes also appeared simultaneously as if by magic. But for all that, they had one common feature. They were compatible between themselves, and this gave viable posterity. A new species cannot appear at once without having some transitional forms and going through the process of the accumulation and strengthening of positive mutations. Nothing of the kind is observed in the case of modern man. Homo sapiens just materialized from nowhere, and not a single skeleton older than 40,000 years has been found, although human skeletons are found everywhere since then and up to the present. However, according to the found skeletons, the white, yellow, red and black races can be clearly determined. Moreover, the older skeletons, the stronger racial features, which indicates the primordial purity of these races, which existed until they actively began to mix. Therefore, there could not be some single race, according to the opinion of orthodox science. It was the black race which, on its settling in Central America, mutated, and as a result new races, white, yellow and red, originated. Doesn't really make much sense, does it? But the facts themselves show quite the contrary. It's not the appearance of new races that has happened and still happens, but on the mixing of these races. The origin of sub-races, which means hybrid, and their gradual convergence occurs. Now it's almost impossible to find representatives of an absolutely pure nationality because of the fact that the processes of people mixing compromises both different nationalities within one race and also different races. Now, what the consequences of this are, we will consider later, but let's get back to the subject of appearance of modern man and different races on Earth. Now, according to this information, at least 4 transitional humanoid species have existed, and accordingly 4 species which had the necessary positive mutations. Neanderthal men, who by the way were the only humanoid species which had preceded modern man, were not and could not have been modern man's progenitors. This is not a supposition but a bare fact. The DNA research of Neanderthal man found frozen in the Alpine glacier gave a sensational result. Homo sapiens and Neanderthal men are as genetically incompatible as a horse and a zebra. Although these species belong to one and the same mammal order, what is known as the artiodactyls, these 2 humanoid species are not only incompatible, they were not even able to produce sterile hybrids, as happens, for example, when crossing a horse and a donkey. Only skeleton which combined characteristics of both species, Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthal man, was found in the South American mountains. But its proprietor did not live till puberty, i.e. it died while it was still a child, which indicates the complete incompatibility of these species, and this kind of makes it a fact. Moreover, Neanderthal man had happily lived for hundreds of thousands of years and then rapidly died only when modern man appeared. It took them only 1,000 years of coexistence with a more progressive species to die out in an organised manner in order to vacate the place for Cro-Magnon man. All humanoid primates have thick hair which covers almost all of their whole body. Such species like gorilla, orangutan and chimpanzees are considered the closest species to modern man, are almost all fully covered with hair. Even though they've dwelt in the climatic conditions of the tropical and equatorial zones for millions of years, you think they would be better without the hair. But they failed to shed their hair cover and to become reasoning, while modern man appeared ready-made naked with only rudimentary remains of hair cover on the body. This proves we didn't come from apes. So the retaining of the hair and not having hair is kind of rudimentary but unnecessary. It came to naught in the course of time. The question arises, where did it take place? Obviously not on Earth, or this one anyway. So the question arises, where did they come from, if not originating from here? All scientific evidence garnered has ever found or been able to show who or what is the missing link in the human evolution. In the next phase we will delve into the real origins of modern man. Now, the great continent we've never heard about was called Darya, D-A''Arya. It is mentioned in several sources in Russia, but nowhere else, so it appears. Now, slowly it began to sink on the seabed in the area of the modern North Pole 110,000 years ago. This was also known as Hyperborea. That is best known for the only Olympian out of the 12 in Greek history to frequent that place in winter times and share knowledge, healing and seeing with the peoples of Hyperborea. That person was known as Apollo, who was venerated by the Hyperboreans, who sent him gifts down to the temple in Delos, where Apollo resided. A place beyond the Boreas, which means north wind, was perfect, with the sun shining 24 hours a day. A sister island of Hyperborea was Thule. And many of you will know the legend of the Thule girls, of which Maria Orsic was the most famous known of them, who went on to form the Vril Society. Yet again, these appear to be of Rus origin, blonde hair and blue eyes. Now, I am aware of the stigma that brings to people's thoughts due to how the whole Aryan race was written against and around World War II. But like the Jewish peoples in the previous chapter, we cannot sweep them all with the same brush, when so much of our history is reversed and distorted. Maria, it's stated, was born in Croatia and was very advanced spiritually and other ways. And they were helping Germany initially during World War II, until they realised there were others behind the front man, Hitler, who had very wrong purposes for their knowledge. And Maria completely disappeared in 1945 and was never seen again. And I am speculating, as I am aware, one of the Vril girls is being held hostage by the militaries, and it's quite possible she is that person. People will argue she's too old. Some people of higher spiritual abilities are a lot older than we think. You'll find out that later. Not everyone lives 70 to 100. Some live a long, long time. Well, people will say she's dead now, but what if she was from the line of the original Thule and Hyperboreans, where it was stated that the Hyperboreans lived to the age of 1000. Oops. And enjoyed lives of complete happiness. So what happened to the continent, the Arya? Well, here is the Vedic text describing what took place 110,000 years ago with the most advanced species that ever resided here, spiritually wise. And it states, you lived a tranquil life on Midgard since olden times, since the world became a safe and settled place. Remember Dazdbog deeds, as they are written in the Vedas. Dazdbog is another name for Tark, who was an Aquilia god patron. God is a different meaning, I'll explain that later. He gave the 9 Vedic books to the Rus people. And the term gods back then is not the same as it is now. By gods, it meant they were understood to be highly evolved people. Now, people can become highly evolved in one lifetime. So it doesn't necessarily all have to be ascended masters arriving in crafts from multiple light years away. If you were a highly evolved person in this lifetime, you would be classed as a god back then. And it tells the tale of how he destroyed the Koshis, bulwarks, which means bases, placed upon the nearest moon. The nearest one. I've said in previous shows we had 3 moons. This document proves it. And how Tark would not permit the insidious Koshis to destroy Midgard as they had destroyed Dea, D-E-A. Now Dea is now the asteroid belt between the orbits of the planets Mars, which was known then as the Earth of Ore, and Jupiter the Earth of Perun. Now Perun will be a familiar name in these texts because he's the person that kept coming down and talking to the people. The waters of the moon created the flood. When the moon shattered to pieces, they fell from the sky to the earth like a rainbow, and like spharogiches, I nearly got that right, which means meteorites, a ray came down on Midgard earth. The ancient threads, which reached far, distant palaces, were destroyed. Now, palaces in those times meant constellations, ancient threads that went to other constellations. Gates, in other words, you'll hear more about them shortly. And the links between the worlds were broken. The faraway calls were not heard anymore. Many Vitmaras were lost in the heavens. Vitmana, a celestial chariot. Then people moved large distances of planetary scale by means of Vitmanas with an N, and between planets by the means of Vitmaras with an R. Each Vitmara could carry up to 144 Vitmanas. Until new threads were born, in other words, the gates were returned, or the portals, and their calls were heard in the palaces, constellations, as it follows from the Vedas, the Arya sank into the ocean abyss as a result of Dazdabog's actions to destroy the bases of the Koshis, rulers of the Grey, part of which was located on Lelia. Now, Lelia is the nearest, or was the nearest moon to Midgard, which is one of the 3 moons which our planet had back then, 110,000 years ago, called Fata, Lelia, and Messiats. Some Slavs still call the remaining moon of our planet Messiats. Now, Lelia, which was the nearest moon, took only 7 days to orbit the Earth. That means it was only a quarter of the distance to the current moon. Fata's orbital period, and ancient Greeks called this planet Phaeton, was 13 days, so pretty much half the orbit of the current moon. Dazdabog, or the god Tark Perunovich, a god keeper of the ancient great wisdom, was called giving a god, which means Daz or Daj is to give, and Bog is God, which is a higher evolved being, because he gave the 9 Santias, which is the books, to the people of the great race and the descendants of the celestial kin. These people were known as the Rus, hence the term Rusha. The Koshis, the princes of darkness, were the authentic rulers of the dark worlds, along with the dark legs and the dark R-legs. And in Russian fairy tales, in the Russian epic heroes, the battle with Koschei, the immortal rescuing Vasilisa, the beautiful, who symbolizes the motherland, Midgard Earth, from its claws. Now, as a result of the Star Wars between light and dark forces, one moon, Lelia, went off its orbit, and its splinter meteorites fell on the Earth, causing a planetary catastrophe. The tectonic plates were displaced, and Arya sank into the Arctic Ocean. You didn't hear about that continent, did you? I wonder why. Undoubtedly, this continent did exist and was an ancient motherland of the white race. As a result of the catastrophe, it went down to the seabed, but there's another question then: where are the sunken continents? Which were the ancient motherlands of the other races? You see, there was a giant flood. it literally wiped everything out. Imagine you see what happens when there's an earthquake of 7 or 8 on the Richter scale, and the tsunami caused through the Indian Ocean. Can you imagine a whole continent dropping into the water? And water and a whole moon raining down from the sky. Where are the continents of the yellow, black and red races? And if these sunken continents existed, the probability of their simultaneously immersion on the bottom of the ocean is 0. In fact, there were not many unnecessary continents on Midgard Earth back then. So there are no arguments which could explain the absence of fossil remains of transitional forms. The reason this is impossible to explain is simple. Modern man, basic races of Homo sapiens, never evolved on Midgard Earth. The Slavonic Aryan Vedas tells that after the Arya had disappeared under the water, many people died then before they had time to go up in Vitmana's craft, or to go through the stargates, as they had broken them off, and to hide themselves in the Palace of the Bear, which means the constellation of Ursa Minor and Ursa Major. The threads of the constellations are broken again. That is why the celestial needles lost their colour. In order for the needles to shine again with colours, you should replace the crystals of Erkama by the crystals of Tara, and you will recover the threads through Zimun. This is according to the scripts. So it's explaining how it can all be fixed back up again. The threads of palaces were broken again, therefore the celestial needles lost their colour. Well, this phrase clearly tells you about the devices of the interplanetary or interstellar connection, which our ancestors named celestial needles. We would probably call them portals today, stargates. To fix it, you had to replace the crystals of Erkama with the crystals of Tara in order to re-establish the broken connection. But the crystals of Erkama were not located in the ocean depths. They would have stood out where the Arya went down, but on dry land, and most likely in the territory of modern Siberia, where according to the Vedas, our ancestors moved. Second, the crystals of Erkama did not work, either because of the death of the subscriber or as a result of receiving devices destruction of the local celestial needles. Now, what this tells you, for those of you who listen to the show regularly, I've told you about certain bunkers around the world that contain gold and other things, and only people of the highest vibration and evolutionary development, which is in accordance with your harmonic frequency you go off, will be able to handle or go into those vaults, will be able to look inside or connect with or operate with any of the arcs, whether it's the covenant, Ark of the Covenant or the Ark of Gabriel. There's 7 in total. The same thing applies with these crystals. They wouldn't work because the death of the subscriber. Now, third, it is offered to restore the connection through Zimun, and the constellation which coincides almost fully with the modern constellation of Ursa Minor, and to use for this purpose the crystals of Tara. Now, of course, Tara is a famous name in Ireland. She was also the wife of Tark, who is the son of Perun, who was the ruler of the inhabited world, back then anyway, of Jupiter. Well, this means that each crystal provided the connection with different star systems and had its proper name and different internal structure. Some, as it follows from the Slavonic Aryan Vedas, had abandoned Midgard Earth on the Vitmanas. Some went through the stargates and hid in the Palace of the Bear. And in other words, some people, one way or another, were able to abandon Midgard Earth and settle on one of the planets in the constellation of the Bear. There is a question, did all who had not died abandon Midgard Earth, or some, nevertheless, did they remain? If no one was left on Midgard Earth after the catastrophe, then it turns out the second colonization of our planet happened about 40,000 years ago, and those who saved themselves in the constellation of the Bear, Ursa Minor, returned. Or probably some people had moved to the Siberian expanses and began to grow roots in a new place. But if that is so, Siberia continues to keep the proofs of presence of a highly developed civilization in the bowels of the earth. And time will come, and probably has come already, when these proofs will appear before an amazed humanity which has forgotten its star roots. A sobering thought is that our ancestors who lived in harmony with nature, so many of us are trying to restore or return that, where they were highly evolved spiritually and evolutionary, stacked with knowledge, who also had the ability to travel by craft and by gate to all corners of the universe, speak to other beings on other worlds as a matter of fact, and all that was stripped away by the dark forces who go by many names. And what we are left with, due to the broken stargates and celestial needles, left us cut astray, far away from all our brothers and sisters in the universe and beyond, and have been left to be abused, tortured, terrorized, and loosed like a battery at the behest of demonic dark forces. But the worst aspect of it is we are reduced to not knowing who or what we are, where we came from, little to no knowledge, a confused state, feeling that everything is outside of us, and we have to worship externally to God or gods who are just loosing your energy and your life force. Like children of the universe, and only now are we reawakening from this amnesic hell and taking the first steps towards restoring ourselves and Midgard. Hi all, and welcome back. Right, having gone through modern man, how it arrived, and catastrophic wars and the history of Russia, well, now we're going to touch on some religious items. And it's often a testy subject for many people. When you start delving into the research of it, large chunks of it falls apart and doesn't make sense. And because we've not had a real chronological history of many things, it gets rewritten in their image, not in ours. Now, in the previous piece I mentioned about worshipping God or gods as loosing our energy, and how and why I come to that conclusion, how that was achieved by programming the populace with an external belief system known as religion. This mode of control has done much damage to the human psyche, not to mention the endless deaths perpetrated in the name of the church, the name of a God, or Jesus. But since whence does Jesus, as he is more commonly known as, I may add more on that later, advocate violence in his name? Why would a loving, nice God of wisdom declare fighting in his name, death and destruction, be advocated as something of virtue? So we have to take on board what the Vedas knew and report about religion. Modern science has nothing intelligible to say on this occasion, therefore we have nothing left but to fix our eyes on legends, myths and religions. But the basis of the majority of contemporary world religions is Judaism. All branches of Christianity came out of it, because the Old Testament is the Talmud adapted for non-Jews, which in turn is an interpretation of the Torah, or more precisely of the Pentateuch. I hope I said that right. Islam, in its turn, is an interpretation of Christianity and was actually one of its sects until 1180, when Constantinople church hierarchs proclaimed it an anathema, denunciation involving excommunication, to the god of Mahomet, which is said to be the god forged by hammer, which did not give birth, is not born, and which no one is like. Now, on the subsequent ecumenical council, the excommunication was accepted. In other words, Islam is a Protestantism of the Eastern Christian sect. Same thing, different branch. Before the Aryan tribes first arrived in ancient India, 4,821 years ago, in 2692 BC roughly, it was called Dravidia. That was the original name back then. And it had been inhabited by what was they called back then the Negroid tribes, the black tribes. The Dravidian and the Naga people, Naga known as the serpent. The Aryan tribes brought them the Vedic knowledge, banishing from Dravidia, now India, black magicians. That was the real quest, to rid this planet of the dark magicians. It still goes on to this day. Now, the black magicians who had practiced the cult of goddess Kali, the Black Mother, to which they offered human sacrifices. That's where the term Kali Ma, Black Mother. It is fully possible that the phrase, they were both naked, Nagas, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed, could mean that they were both people of the black race and worshipped the goddess Kali, the Black Mother, and were not ashamed of this. The Israelites, using the ancient Vedic sources for writing their sacred books, could not miscomprehend the sense of the word, or did not want to focus their attention thereon. The point is that the Israelites belonged to what was called a grey subrace, which originated as a result of the mixture of the two races, the white and black ones. And by sub, I mean hybrid, not inferior. The Aryans conquered Dravidia for the first time about 5,000 years ago, but the active interracial mixing between the white and black races and the origin of the new subrace hybrid, the grey one to which the Israelites belong, had begun long before. Now, there was people that were known to the Aryans as derelicts, people who were either rejected by the white race or voluntarily abandoned their motherland because Aryan law prevented them from, according to them, realising their ambitions had come to ancient India long before the first Aryan campaign took place. But what was more likely is that waves of derelicts rolled over Dravidia for several millennia, one after the other. By the time the Aryans first conquered Dravidia, and by conquered I mean ended the black mother worship and the sacrifice, not war, the grey subrace had already been formed. It is of interest that the Old Testament, being in fact a mythological description of the history from the Torah of the Judaic people, places the paradise in Eden in the east. This is where it gets interesting, for some anyway. There were 4 gardens of Eden, not one. The main one being in what is now known as India. From the Old Testament, it says, "And the river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. The first name of the first is Pison, which encompassed the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium, which was an aromatic gum, and the onyx stone. The name of the second river is Gihon, the same that encompassed the whole land of Ethiopia. The name of the third river is Hiddekel, that which goeth towards the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates, and the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it, all good stuff. But then he says, don't eat the fruit of knowledge, for that is a sin, and you will be cast out." Really? Well, when you find out who the Lord is, and it's not God, but Anu, the reptile king of the Draco, then perhaps it becomes more clear of who this being is and his and their intentions. Look at it logically. It says in the book, he made man in his likeness and image. But he didn't want him to have knowledge. Why bother putting the tree there in the garden in the first place? Why bother doing that? Because he wanted man to fail, is why. An obedient, no knowledge slave for those who don't know. The name for the God of knowledge is known as sin. Now the river Pison is the river Ganges, because Eden in Hebrew is Gan Eden. And when the Aryan tribes defeated the Dravidian black magicians' civilization, they came to Mesopotamia, which means the land between the 2 rivers. Later on, the representatives of the grey race, mixture of the white Russians and the black Dravidians, which some will say devil worshippers, who were involved in that cult. I'm not too sure it was a whole race of people, but it's also noteworthy to point out that the country known as Iran literally means the land of the Aryans. Oops. Azerbaijan also. Now, the former Iran is where the original Mana Kingdom was located in the first millennium BC. So clearly, as some would like to proffer up as a denial of the knowledge and pull out the race card of all things Aryan is all about the white race only. Clearly that's not correct. It was about teaching all the peoples of the world to be in a better vibration. Colours, races or countries didn't matter. Why would Iran be called the land of the Aryans if it was about white only? And only the political correct narrative aligned with the BS history written into it and surrounding World War II, having destroyed between 70 and 90 million Rus people that completely were erased from history in the previous 30 years. They then set out to denigrate everything else and create a negative about the Aryan race, all surrounding a German narrative about a special super race of blue-eyed blondes. They were right in the first part. They were a special race. But the conditions laid forth to accomplish that was never Aryan in origin. The irony is all of this is neither Hitler nor any of his leading SS were blue-eyed blondes. So according to their alleged narrative, they would have been wiped out also. Does that make sense? Given Hitler's mother was Jewish and also possibly a Rothschild, it makes less sense, and yet in some ways makes more sense of what is really going on and being portrayed to the public. The Dravidian black magicians were not fully destroyed. Some were able to hide in their ancient motherland, the African continent, most likely in the second Eden in Ethiopia, which was called the land of Kush, K-U-S-H, and the greater part of the Dravidian and Naga people remained in India. Some returned to the northeast of Africa, and some settled in Mesopotamia in the Middle East. However, most likely the majority of descendants of derelicts who had formed this new, what is called the grey subrace, abandoned their new motherland fearing the punishment because their ancestors had violated the Rita laws, R-I-T-A, which means divine law or divine truth. Now, Eden was clearly a sacred place for the tribes of the Dravidian and the Naga people who worshipped the Black Mother, especially for the priestess goddess Kali Ma, because the servants of this goddess were all women. Based on his research on the Bible, Alexander Philippov left in search of the biblical paradise and found it in India. And he saw a picturesque valley with striking plants, animals and birds. It indeed had a border in the form of a horseshoe-shaped chine, and the word paradise means in Persian a stone swell which surrounds a garden. The river Son, which flowed from the valley, also had an obvious border in the form of an even line of rapids beyond which even the colour of water was different. Everything emphasised that this landscape was not of this world. There were stone gates in the east side of the valley, at the confluence of the rivers. Near the gates there was an enormous statue with a sword. It is impossible to not remember cherubim and a flaming sword put to guard the gates of paradise. So from all the biblical descriptions, this person found the original Eden. Not far away from where the statue with the sword was a tree, grew with the sculptures of 3 cobras. It was enclosed and decorated with flowers and beads, and there was an enormous handmade tree with a serpent winding around its trunk in the heart of the valley. It turned out that for the Hindu, which are descendants of the Dravidian and Naga people, it was a sacred place. They think that Shiva was born in this valley. Shiva in Hinduism and Brahmanism is one of the 3 supreme deities along with Brahma and Vishnu. Now Brahma is a god creator, Vishnu is a god keeper, and Shiva is a god destroyer. Shiva in Hinduism is a great god, Mahadeva. Only Brahma and Vishnu were his equals. Shiva is said to be eternal. He is the head of evil spirits, the god of fury, madness and wild orgies, and at the same time the god of asceticism and the head of yogis. Shiva is the killer of Kama, the deity of love, who dared to trouble his soul. His symbols are, take note, a bull, phallus and moon. The god of fury with symbols of a bull, phallus and moon. Oh my. He's usually portrayed with a trident and a necklace made of human skulls. Nice chap. Of course, Shiva is the egregore for in the front of the CERN building, or was. Shiva's cult requires human sacrifice again. Shiva's wife, Kali, the horrific Kali Ma, is an exact likeness of her husband. It should be noted that Shiva's cult originated in the time of patriarchy, which forced out goddesses, in particular the goddess Kali Ma, into the background, occupying her niche and keeping her specific feature, the human sacrifice. The human sacrifices to Shiva have never stopped and continue to this day. There was a recent incident involving someone from the church. A temple priest chopped off the head of an 8-year-old boy with a dagger to honour the deity by human sacrifice in a town in Bijnor district. The incident came to light when the boy, hailing from Kalagar, was reported missing after he had gone to Shiva's temple to play with his friends. His body was later recovered from the nearby bushes, and upon interrogation the priest confessed to the crime, and the police said adding the priest had been arrested. Certainly human sacrifices takes place secretly and on a much lesser scale compared to ancient times, but it does not change the essence of this cult. So the god Shiva simply adopted an historical relay race from the hands of the goddess Kali Ma. Shiva's status as a husband of a goddess called Kali the Horrific only confirms this succession. Now I want to make it clear, I'm not telling anyone, this is me, that there is no God, as it's called. To me it's known as Source. And each and every one of you is part of that. So in essence, you are all the God particle. So why not worship yourself? Why do we have to sacrifice people to these dark magicians? All the so-called gods in scriptures were not God at all, but sick and twisted individuals portraying and bestowing themselves with false titles. The embodiment is replicated here via the bloodline families. Another group who think they are more important or more special than everyone else. Message to them: you're not. Now, this next topic has kind of bugged me for a number of years. After seeing patterns of names in places and planets as to why you are was in so many of them. Now I've finally got a handle on it and why, and lots of things suddenly all start fall into place, as things do. So who or what are the heirs? Well, they are a highly developed people who came from other planets and lived among the people of the white race in Hyperborea, the Arya, and also Lemuria regions. They came to Dravidia, India, with the Slavonic Aryan Rus tribes. Now, the heirs were the Aryan teachers and defenders. They possessed extensive knowledge and tremendous abilities which seemed supernatural for the people of other races, in this case for the people of the black race, to which the Dravidian and the Naga people belonged to. Well, the heirs were the representatives of the light forces of the universe. They were the Volkovs, the Vedans, and the white magicians for the Aryans. In principle, exactly these Volkovs organized the campaign and led the Aryan tribes to Dravidia in order to stop the distribution of the dark forces' influence. Next is an excerpt from the text stating what took place. In the times of a new great Asa, battle in the heavens, which is the battle between light and dark, the dark were expelled from all earths of the Makosh. Remember, earths means inhabited planet, not just this place. Makosh is the Great Bear. They were expelled from Radha, which is now known as Orion, and the race palaces, which is Leo. Therefore, the dark way of spirits and souls began to go only through the world of people who lived on the earths in the arm of the Swati galaxy. Could be the Milky Way, I'm not too sure. An ascension along the Golden Way became possible only through the world of people. An important line. Midgard Earth, being in the middle between light and darkness, began to play an important role. Therefore, the dark forces decided to give power over the people to demons. That is why there is a fight between dark and light forces on Midgard Earth, in which people from different clans and nations took part. That was from one of the verses. Now, demons are mainly the non-corporeal forms known as dark jinns, smoky-type beings, or the spirits, the ghost world. Of course, people in recent times of the Western world, but not so amongst the native tribes, known as the other races, black, yellow and red, started on the same path as the other three races, using hallucinogenic drugs to get highs, but also entered the spirit world. Now, whether knowingly or not, people know my opinion on those drugs, but here is the medical and heirs' knowledge of what happens and the said consequences of taking these hallucinogenic drugs. Until now, the American Indian shamans from Central and South America used peyote, ayahuasca and other plants which contain one or another narcotic substance to bring themselves into the state of trance in order to contact the world of spirits. The shamans of Siberia used poisonous mushrooms for those ends, for example fly agarics. Nevertheless, the majority of these plants grow in the equatorial or tropical zones of our planet, which historically were natural to the habitat of the black and red races. Most known hallucinogens are fatal, being taken in large doses. Lesser doses cause serious psychical disturbances pretty quickly and can lead to death in the end. Narcotic substances belong to the group of vegetable poisons which render maximal effect on the neurons of the brain, because the nerve cells are the most sensitive and the blood, going on in its small circle of circulation, first enters the cerebrum, bearing the maximal concentration of the hallucinogens. As a result, the quantity of poisons that enters each brain cell in a time unit is several times greater than the neurons of the human brain are able to neutralize. It can't keep up with it. Therefore, the poisonous molecules getting through the cell's protective billows begin to destroy the neurons of the brain. The nerve cells begin to die, and in order to prevent the death of the brain and the whole organism, the human spirit is forced to unfold its brain structures of other levels of reality when the brain is not ready for this. As a result, the powerful streams of primary matters, which we covered in the Humanity Unplugged series, which flow through the brain, destroys the poisons, and for a short time a person gets the possibility to see, hear and feel what's going on at other levels of reality. Moreover, a person who possesses brightly expressed paranormal abilities is able to act there, which the ancient priestesses and priests used in full measure. So the prohibition to eat the fruits of the tree of knowledge, as it follows from the above, had quite a real basis. Now everyone is aware of the fact that drugs destroys the human organism, psyche, and tell on the descendants of a drug addict, so it is passed down. Moreover, drugs have a very pernicious influence on the development of a person, who in most cases degrades and becomes a toy in the hands of the spirit parasites, which is actually the real death of a person. These are known as the walk-ins. Excess alcohol can also have the same effects, and as for the spirits, drinks like whiskey, vodka, rum, they call that spirits for a reason. I can feel an awful lot of gulping amongst listeners now. Oh my God, I never knew that. You see, there is a reason those plants grew in the tribal areas, as they were more susceptible to the spirit invasions. And those peoples were used as a tool of the dark to get at the rest of the populace. So don't go blaming the people of colour for it. They were used as pawns. Dancing in the spirit world with no knowledge is why some people, many people in a way, become infected. Well, what do I mean by infected? Well, it has a few points. Most drugs give you a high and then a low, leading to swings in moods. That is not being in balance, is it? Mood behaviour can be quite severe in some cases, leading to criminality, abuse, both projected and self-harm, a social outcast, and some drugs make you apathetic and lethargic. So you don't see what's going on around you and subsequently don't fight back against the system. This to me appears to be the major problem in Western countries. We're not fighting back enough against the system of control and abuse against us. Another aspect of dancing with the spirits is it can lead to the body getting illness or disease. Spirits reside in the astral realm, and their only source of sustenance is us. This is where cancer comes from. An astral realm infection passed across by the spirits. But the worst aspect of engaging the spirit world is too few know what they are getting into. So many go in with no shielding, and also PSI field aura damage due for previous drug use, and spirits hitch a ride in and on your vessel. Oops. A one-way ticket, unless you know someone who knows how to get rid of them. They're not easy to remove. They become part of you. These can also be known, if it's a full possession, as walk-ins, and you'll be amazed at how many people carry hosts. If people could see in a different frequency, you'd be shocked at how many people are carrying hosts. How can you spot them in a person? Well, the average person should be able to notice a marked change in character and behaviour. Seers can see the physical manifestation, but there's not enough seers. But for those that disbelieve, I will repeat the lines from the verse above. Therefore the dark way of spirits and souls began to go only through the world of people. Hello darkness, my old friend. Well, darkness can be a friend. It can teach you lessons, life lessons. Not everything about dark is negative. It can be taken in as a positive if used in the right way. The idea that they wanted the heirs and the Rus wanted to wipe out the dark forces is not correct. They wanted to wipe out the practices of the dark forces and then hopefully go on and teach them how to operate in a better way. But the dark and light forces and the war is the next topic that we're going to be covering. This, given the time now, we're about 2 hours, 10 minutes in, and I'm about a third of the way through. Will probably be the last one tonight, and I may do the second part tomorrow. Tomorrow evening. We'll see how time goes. So the dark and light forces, some class it as good and evil. Some say that it's all very subjective and relative. And they would be partly right, but only partly. Good manifested towards one person can bring evil to many. And evil manifested towards many persons can bring good to one. The concepts of good and evil are not absolute, but relative. But these concepts become absolute ones when they are applied to certain situations and events. Besides, if we take into account the fact that very often evil puts on robes of holiness and speaks on behalf of the latter, it's possible to recognize the true mask of evil only through the deeds. Now, at the pinnacle of dark forces is parasitism. They are a parasitic nature. They are parasitic to themselves as well as others, but also ultimately creation itself, the light ones. Parasites are those who exist at the expense of others. There are plenty of parasites in nature. We may assume that being parasitic is a natural, necessary phenomena of nature, and this will be absolutely wrong. It's only what we've been conditioned to think. Any parasite which operates on a living organism or on the organism of society, sucking out the vital juices, either dies together with the donor or finds a new one. One way or another, any parasite brings destruction and chaos with him, and therefore carries the negative evolution, and therein lies the problem. However, in the animal kingdom, parasites fulfill a positive role. They eliminate the weak organisms. If they have a number of what sort of myself with my own pet. She had 6 pups. One of them was clearly sick and she ignored it. We tried to get her to feed it. Didn't want to know. She knew it wouldn't last, and it was more important that the other 5 remain strong. So they go about eliminating weak organisms, primarily the genetically weak, which favours the preservation of the species and the evolution of the most healthy and adjusted individuals. And in the end, they favour positive evolution. Unlike natural parasites, social parasites first eliminate the strongest and healthiest elements of the social organism, thus completely destroying it. Therefore, social parasites promote negative evolution and undoubtedly carry evolutional death, whatever point of view one may consider. Now, according to the Slavonic Aryan chronology, 2,817 years after the day of the signing of a peace treaty, or 2692 BC, there was a war between Arimia, Arimia, which is now known as China, and the Great Ruthenia, as it was called then, a part of the Slavonic Aryan Empire, which occupied the territory west of what is now known as the Riffian, or formerly known as the Ural Mountains. Now, the war was very severe and also unequal. However, the Great Ruthenia won a victory over the ancient China, which was known as Arimia. And the victory was so significant and heavy that the Russian ancestors selected the day of the signing of the peace treaty on September the 22nd, according to the Christian calendar, as a new reference point of their history. Now, as I said earlier, the Aryan tribes undertook their first campaign in order to stop human sacrifices and the worship of the goddess Kali Ma. After banishing the priestesses of the Black Mother from the temples, they then returned home, and the campaign lasted 76 years in total, and the Aryan tribes returned to their motherland in 2616 BC. But unfortunately, after they left, the Dravidian and Naga people went back to the old traditions for the reasons mentioned before. Therefore, the Aryans undertook a second campaign, which, due to a number of reasons, took place only 610 years after the first one, which was 2006 BC, and the second campaign differed fundamentally from the first one. A part of the Aryans stayed in Dravidia, now India, and began to form the civilization which is now known as the Indian civilization. The Khan Uman, the supreme priest of the goddess Tara light cult. The goddess Tara was a patroness of nature, and her senior brother Tark, or Zagbog, was a keeper of the ancient great wisdom. They both headed this campaign and was appointed a spiritual advisor to the Tsar of the forest people. And this is how this event is reflected in the Slavonic Aryan Vedas. Was stated, other clans of the great race will settle all over the face of Midgard earth. Some will cross the Himalayan mountains to teach the people with the skin the colour of darkness, the wisdom of the world of shine. That's what they were going to teach, the light. So they would stop making frightful and bloody sacrifices to their goddess, the Black Mother, and to the snake dragons from the world of Nav, N-A-V, and to find there a new divine wisdom and faith. So everything is fairly clear here. However, I would like to draw your attention to the phrase, and to the snake dragons from the world of Nav, and how it relates to the Old Testament. First, it mentions the serpent which tempted Eve, and the woman said, the serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. Now, both the Slavonic Aryan Vedas and the Old Testament tell about the serpent, or serpents, manifesting through a woman priestess of the goddess Kale, Eve. Second, according to Slavonic Aryan Vedas, the world of Nav is the name of the world of spirits, the jinns, where the souls of both people and animals continue to exist after death, as well as the spirits of extinct species converted into spirit parasites. Now, this is essentially more commonly known for regular listeners as the lower astral realm. It's not a nice place to be. And it all depends on you raising your own personal development, so that your cord is not attached only to the lower astral realm, but the higher realms. This is the Bible's version of hell. All kinds of dark and demonic beings attacking you, doing all kinds of debauchery and whatnot, torture. Now, the higher astral is what's more commonly referred to as heaven, and that comes before you then develop onto the mental planes, where you're completely out of the astral connection, and you only go into there by choice to do certain battle during dream time. But if you're only at the vibration of lower astral, then all your dreams are going to take place in that. And that's why there's so many people who are stuck in the lower astral on personal development develop illness and disease. It's a spiritual development blocking that these dark forces are imposing on us. Once you get onto the mental planes, then things change altogether. You suddenly start developing abilities you never thought you had, where information comes to you rather than information you researching it. Truth comes easier. Discernment comes easier. Some people can do telekinesis. Some people can do telepathy. Some people can bilocate. Some people can heal to both themselves and others, with distance not an obstacle. And that's what all takes place when you reach the mental planes of personal development. So these spirit beings, their existence without physically dense bodies made the spirits of extinct animals adapt fundamentally to another level of existence incorporeal, i.e. without bodies, which unfortunately led them to parasitism. Some extinct animals became creature parasites, which devoured the life force of those who luckily possessed physically dense bodies and were transformed into so-called astral animals, which, according to the Slavonic Aryan invaders, dwelt in the world of Nav. That is why the Slavonic Aryan invaders tell about snake dragons, the spirits of extinct species of reptiles, dinosaurs, which many people call dragons to this day. And in all Russian folk tales and legends, dragons were called Zime Goreniches. In Russia and Ukraine, a particular dragon-like creature by the same name has 3 heads that grow back, is green, walks on 2 back paws, has small front paws, and spits fire. This is where the fire dragon comes from. And it's interesting that both the Old Testament and also the Vedic texts mention this fact, and this is not the last one. However, more interesting things are yet to come, and the next part of the text is revealing of what happened after the conquests, and those unable or unwilling to shine the light and wish to dance with the dark. In the text it says, using lies and sinful flattery, they will occupy many lands of Midgard earth, as they have done on other earths. In many worlds in the days of the last great Asa, the war between light and dark, but they will be defeated and exiled to the country of artificial mountains. That place is known as Egypt today. The dark will be defeated and exiled to the artificial mountains, Egypt. When you think of some of the pharaohs that were there, perhaps that makes a bit more sense. Where people with the skin of the colour of darkness and the descendants of the celestial clan who came from the earth of the god Nai, N-I-Y, will live. And human children will begin to teach them to work so they can grow cereals and vegetables to feed their children. Now, during the second campaign, the Aryan tribes defeated the troops of black magicians, the majority of whom were women priestesses of the Black Mother cult. The surviving supporters of the black cult were then exiled to Egypt. Now, this may explain the changes that were going on or ongoing in Egypt around that time, where they started erasing history, eradicating and defacing certain statues of the buildings that were never built by the Egyptians to begin with. Those pyramids are at least 25,000 years old, and the Sphinx was built before them. Now, even some of the archaeological people of today have now worked this out, and the Sphinx has water erosion, and yet that region has had no significant rain for the last 11,000 years. So quite why they keep spinning the nonsense that they were built 5,000 years is completely beyond me. But that is applying logic. Seems they don't apply that. But the reality is, even with our current advanced machinery and technology, we still couldn't build the pyramids to that tolerance level now. Plus the fact, how did they know all the compass points of the planet? Or the fact that Giza is the centre without viewing it from miles above. And it's this type of insane logic that seems to bypass most who have zero critical thinking skills. How can they map the centre on the ground? You can only do it from an overview point of view, which means you have to go miles up into the sky to realise where is the centre, what is north, what is south, what is east, and what is west. So the fact that it was Egyptians, so after the second campaign, the Aryans stayed on and continued to work to changing the Dravidian and Naga people's genetics, and we're going to get into this next. Black magicians were also interested in genetics. The people of this, what is called the grey subrace, were of particular interest to them because they carried both types of genetics, the white and the black ones, and were an ideal weapon against the white light magicians, and also against the white race civilization. After the Aryans defeated the black magicians, they offered them several places for their exile, because the Urs, who were the white race's spiritual teachers and leaders, never destroyed the defeated enemies. It was not the way to be, but tried to help them to follow a righteous way or path, about which the Black Forces leaders knew perfectly well. Therefore, they prepared the centres of the future fight against their opponents and secured the support of their followers beforehand. Thus, the black magicians created 3 centres: Dravidia, land of Kush, Ethiopia, and Mesopotamia, Assyria. And the last one was the secondary centre. It was a secondary centre, being in fact a connective link between the first 2. Now, at approximately the same time frame, the land of Kush, ancient Ethiopia, in the middle of the 8th century BC, and Assyria in the first half of the 7th century BC, began conducting a very aggressive policy towards their neighbours. As a result, ancient Ethiopia conquered Egypt, and Assyria controlled most of the whole of Mesopotamia, continuously waging wars with their neighbours for 8 centuries. So we then had the outcome of that is the cult of the Black Mother was imposed everywhere, however under different names. Now, what had then transpired is the majority of them were the people of the grey race. Some of them were of the black race, which is Dravidian Naga, and a small part of the white race, who were called the derelicts, not interested in becoming part of the light. So they began their long journey from Dravidia, India, to ancient Egypt, which lasted for 200 years. Sound familiar about the Exodus? Maybe it was a different type of Exodus. And they moved with their families and all their belongings through the lands where, unfortunately for them, not everyone received them with open arms. They were unwelcome in most countries. Often they had to stop for many years just to regain forces, or to force their way with weapons in hand through tribes that were hostile to them. In the course of time they became nomadic tribes, which later historians will call the Hyksos. At the end of the 18th century to beginning of the 17th century BC, they conquered ancient Egypt, and the Hyksos governed there for about 110 years, and only part of them went south to the land of Kush, which is mentioned in the Old Testament as the New Eden. So at the end of the long road, the supporters of the Black Mother cult reached their new paradise, and a new epoch of Midgard-Earth civilization began. It hasn't turned out too well. Thus the Old Testament does not tell about the origin of man as a result of divine creation, but about the fight between light and dark forces on Midgard Earth, as a result of which the supporters of the dark forces were defeated and exiled. But they rose again. So sadly, Eden was not always a garden of paradise. All four of them, as portrayed in the Old Testament, were riddled by dark magicians and people with no purpose or developmental goals in their life. They took the easy path of darkness. So there are no saints and righteous men in the Christian Eden, at least in that Eden, about which the Old Testament tells. And the Christian people should remember carefully where to place their paradise, particularly the fundamentalists, not the faithful. As the word faith has nothing to do with religion. The word faith means the enlightenment by knowledge. And there is no knowledge in the Old Testament. Actually, it can't be. It was written by the dark magicians. Some, nevertheless, might object that if Eden is on Midgard Earth, it's in India. Now, this will be the last part this evening. It's to do with Isis, Ra-El, and its people. And once again, I will repeat, it's not a denigration of the people of Israel. It's the political ideology and the dark magic that operates those people. Let us remember that the Old Testament is a version of the Talmud, which is adapted for the non-Jewish people, which in its turn is a history of the Jewish people. This fact unambiguously follows directly from its text. The events expounded in a Talmud do not concern whatsoever the past of other people, except for those events which were borrowed from them. If we consider otherwise, then it turns out that all people living on Midgard Earth are Israelites, because Adam and Eve were Israelites. Everyone perfectly understands this, and the Israelites, who call all people of the white race Goyim, totally disassociate themselves from both the latter and from the people of all other races. Thus the defenders of the biblical version of origin of man have nothing to say on that particular subject. Now, as we said before, the Israelites belong to the grey subrace, which is an intermediate subrace between white and black races with prevailing white race genetics. Correctly saying, people related to the grey subrace have an insignificant admixture of the black race features. Everyone who is acquainted with genetics, even slightly, knows that a number of features such as the colour of skin, hair and eyes, and the structure of a skull, and the type of exchange processes predominate over the same features of the white race. Therefore, when white and black races mix, the first generation will have most external signs of the black race, including the black skin. Now, before anyone states that this is racism or anti-Semitism, please look at the facts. Like I said, it's not a denigration of any colour or any race. It is basing an assumption based on the facts delivered. In an earlier show of this type, I mentioned the grand experiment about a number of races being brought here in the past for a range of different reasons. It could also be assumed that many were refugees of the Light and Dark War. They were placed in regions of this planet, on this planet, that was conducive to where they came from. And one of the key stipulations of that time was there was to be no mixing of the different races. Now, this could be determined as pure. Can this be determined as being pure racism? Yes, in our current world of political correctness, it appears everything is racist or offensive to someone these days. It leaves people frightened to speak, which only helps the control system. But remember, it was said in the scriptures, Genesis I think, where it stated the Lord, Anu, who did not like them humans mixing well together and speaking the same language. It made them a threat. So he came down and split them up and gave them other languages. That's in the scriptures. So much for the Lord being nice and divine, it seems. So did we have racists back then? Well, who knows? What is the more likely reason, and the evidence does support it, is genetics. Despite looking alike, all the different people all have different genetics. Some mix, some don't. Take the example of Rh negative blood types, who have to have injections to stop the mother attacking and rejecting the baby. I mean, why would a mother's body attack and reject her own child? It doesn't make any sense unless you apply differing genetics that don't match, like the horse and the zebra can't mix. Now, rarely do you see in the animal world them mating with different types. Why? It's because of genetics, and it's got nothing to do with racism. Now, people may cry at this point with valid reasons, but we're all human. Yes, in essence, but very different humanoids would be my response, with completely different genetics. So it's not possible the Bible is correct that we all came from Adam and Eve. Otherwise, we'd all have the same blood group and everything. We'd all be the same colour. You know, if that was the case, according to the book, we would all look like Israelites, but we don't. Of course, the other example, if we all came from Adam and Eve, it would mean that all of us were a product of incest. We only start with two people. That means we're all a product of incest. Does that make sense? Now, you only have to look at the royals or the bloodline families to see how incest has worked out for them. Most of them are complete half-wits. Ugly manifestations. Look at the Rothschilds and Soros. Rockefeller. They all look the same. They got that same look. The UK royals kept incest offspring who didn't turn out too well, either mentally or physically, were placed in the Tower. Rumour has it the current Queen has a sister locked away there. Many years. So, the idea we all came from a product of incest is completely absurd. So back to genetics and the Israelites. The black race were either endowed with or given, which is unsure at this point, black magic, more commonly known as voodoo. I don't know whether it's particular to their group of people or it was introduced. That I'm unsure at this point. But voodoo is powerful and dangerous dark magic, and is and was used for occult and cult practices, like in India with worship of the Kali Ma. In ancient times they were given the knowledge of mixing with white race people. I wonder who gave them that knowledge, which would enhance, well it's not would which does enhance the voodoo even stronger by mixing the races. Now, with the addition of the white magic, this was then used against the light forces and the great white race. Now, I don't say that to be racially superior, but that white race was the most advanced evolutionary spiritual race ever on this planet. It's a fact. And so the mixing was used by the dark forces via the black people to weaken the light forces. Does that make the black people at fault? No. And this is where the Israelites came from. The mixture of white and black race that were cast out of the main Eden in India. They then migrated for 200 years towards Egypt and settled in various places along the way, which would be southern Russia as we now know it, hence the term Khazarians and Ashkenazis, and on to the more familiar terms we have now. It mentioned earlier how these people were rejected in many countries due to their poor behavioural traits, and that was before AD. But since AD, these people have been thrown out of 107 countries. This particular group of people being used as dark magicians has been an ongoing program and problem in society for thousands of years. Now, back then, unlike now, they were not called Jews or Jewish. It was not possible. There was no letter J until the 14th century. The term Jew or Jewish did not come into the 17th century. So when you then realise there was no letter J from AD 0 to the 1400s, the name Jesus, Job, Jewish, Jerusalem could not have been possible. And yet all those names are important people or important regions or important religions. Well, if they're that important, why have they altered the original names? I will have more on that later in the show. But should we denigrate a whole race for that? Absolutely not. These people were used as tools of the dark forces, fed a whole heap of pure, unadulterated lies, and told to think that they were special and above all others, which always leads to derision, told to wish for world destruction by means of Armageddon, of which only they would be saved. I mean, total genocide just to save them? Does that make sense? That is wrong thinking on every level. Personally, I think the general Jewish people have suffered enough. The issue is who is pulling their strings. It always was and always will be until they are stopped. They are being used as pawns on a massive scale by people and beings with a hidden dark agenda. Of course, their role in world history, and in particular in the last 400 to 500 years, has been the cause of great suffering, damage and deaths at the hands of these Zionist dark forces, with names like Rothschilds, Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, Ariel Sharon, Benjamin Begin, who refused to take the Jewish people out of the concentration camps in 1942 when offered to do so in a meeting between Hitler himself and Churchill. The latter of which has a statue honouring him in Jerusalem. Warburgs, Bauer, Weishaupt, Netanyahu, all rolls off the tongue as deliverers in evil, torture and death. all of them are ethnic Jews. You can't keep ignoring it because it's anti-Semitic or it's not politically correct. These people are pioneers of death and destruction. Oh, you can't criticize the Israeli people. Yes, you can. These people are not interested at the top end that are running the poor Jewish people into the ground, running the risk of people firing rockets at them because of these clowns sitting in high towers saying, oh, let's just get rid of this country, let's just wipe 70 million Russians out because we don't like their history and we want to write our own. No. These were the same people who took part in or set about creating a new country along with the Balfour Group. Not returning to the State of Israel, but creating it to fit a narrative. With its main centre, a part of one of the biggest lies perpetrated in our lifetime. Israel is a worship of the dark gods, Isis, Ra, El, which, like Al, both El and Al mean God. The gods of Isis and Ra. In the last 100 years, these Zionists have destroyed Russia and its history, destroyed the Middle East and parts of Arabia, infiltrated the top levels of Britain with their dual citizens and lobby groups that have totally hijacked not only our political system but our justice system. They've trained our police force in brutality, but also hijacked our whole financial system via the Federal Reserve. And then via the Rothschild family, who are the closest in DNA to the Draco of any of the bloodline families here, took over virtually every country's bank. These people are total parasites. And yet so much of our American money goes into funding their brand of genocide. This has to stop. So perhaps now it's easier to grasp why these people that got the person known as Jesus killed. It was another version of the light and dark war. Now, this will probably be the end of the first part. I hope you've enjoyed this. There'll be probably another 3-hour show tomorrow. And I hope it makes you think. I hope it makes you research. But the title of this final song explains their current position of the people known as Jewish. Going forward, we should go together with the better elements within their group in harmony as one. But until then, this has been the Truth, Honour and Integrity Show, and a special edition called From Russia with Love, Part 1. My name is Thomas Williams.